Hey everybody, welcome back to Run and Gun. I'm JT, and in this episode we're going to tackle a topic that a lot of people are very passionate about, and there's a lot of heated arguments about it. And that topic is RAW versus JPEG. Roll the intro. So as always, there's a lot of discussion on RAW versus JPEG in the photo community. Some people only shoot RAW, some people only shoot JPEG, some people shoot both. And I want to start this video off by saying there's no right or wrong answer. RAW and JPEG, like your camera, are just tools for the job, and sometimes there's a better tool for the job, depending on what that photography job is. So we're going to talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of RAW and JPEG and why you would shoot either one. And at any point in this video, feel free to comment on your thoughts, your opinions. Do you shoot RAW? Do you shoot JPEG? Or maybe you shoot both? So let me know down below in the comments. So what exactly is RAW, and what's the difference between RAW and JPEG for those of you that might not know? RAW is going to be a much larger raw data file. It contains a lot more information than the JPEG, and the file size is going to be a lot bigger. And you're going to need a special program to open it, like Photoshop, Camera Raw, or Lightroom. Now, JPEG is a very widely used and highly compressed format. It'll be a smaller file size, and you're going to be able to open that up in a lot more programs, and it's just a faster file to move with. So let's talk about why you would choose either one of those file formats. So we're going to make a list over here to the right of some of the pros and cons of RAW versus JPEG, and hopefully that'll make you a little bit wiser and maybe give you some insight as to which one you should be shooting. So one of the first things to talk about with RAW versus JPEG, your RAW file will come in formats like NEF for Nikon, CR2 for Canon, or my GH5 shoots RW2 RAW files. And there's also a DNG file or digital negative file that is RAW as well. So one of the things that I brought up that I think needs to go on the list first is going to be file size. RAW is going to be a much larger file size, probably about 10 to 15 times the file size as a JPEG. When you're shooting a high quality JPEG, it's probably going to be between 2 and 3 megabytes, where your large high quality RAW is going to be close to 20 to 30 megabytes depending on the camera. I know when I was shooting with the Nikon Z, it was about 45 megapixels, and those were some huge RAW files. So RAW does take up a lot of space, and that's kind of a negative of shooting RAW. You're going to need to buy more hard drive space. Your files are going to transfer a little bit slower, whereas JPEG, you don't need as much file space, and your files are going to transfer a lot faster using JPEGs versus RAW from your memory card to your computer. So just keep that in mind. But one thing to point out, memory is always getting cheaper. Hard drives are always getting cheaper. I'll link to some of my favorite hard drives in the description, and memory cards are getting faster and faster read and write speeds every day. So file size is becoming a lot less of a concern, and I think that's more of a reason to shoot RAW. So with that larger file size of a RAW photo, you're also getting much higher quality. You're getting quality in your colors, you're getting latitude in your exposure, and you're getting an adjustability to your photo that you just don't have in JPEG. So with that 20 to 30 megabyte RAW file, you're getting a lot of information in there. So if you overexpose your shot or you underexpose your shot, you have the ability to pull out details in the shadows or the highlights in Lightroom or Photoshop that you just can't do in a JPEG, because JPEG really clips your highlights and your shadows, and there's only so much detail for you to work with, and there's only so much latitude for you to work with if you're trying to pull back some details from the highlights. And even if you were to underexpose your highlights, you would start to lose detail in the shadow and start getting a noisy or compressed image. And I think that's just one more reason why I shoot RAW. Sharpness is another thing that's extremely important in photography. The reason we put thousands of dollars into high megapixel cameras, and we spend thousands of more dollars in expensive glass so that we get super sharp images. And if you're shooting only JPEG, you're really losing out on a lot of sharpness that you would see in a RAW file. So if we bring up a RAW file versus a JPEG file at 100%, the sharpness isn't even close. It's like comparing apples and oranges. RAW files are just so much sharper, and you have the ability to do so much more noise reduction and sharpening that if you did to a JPEG image, you would start to see some of the compression and some of the ways in which the file works to compress the image is saves it in little blocks of similar areas, and you start seeing that JPEG blocking and artifacting and compression if you start to over sharpen your image, and you don't have to worry about that in RAW. So once again, another reason why I shoot in RAW. So when you shoot in RAW formats like NEF or CR2, you usually need a special program to open those, like Photoshop or Lightroom. So that does make RAW a little bit more expensive. There are some free programs out there, but to get the job done, I personally use Lightroom and Photoshop. But shooting RAW does mean that extra work that you have to put into your image. When your camera saves that RAW file format, it's saving a very flat looking image. If you were to just open a RAW file and just open a JPEG file, the JPEG at first glance usually looks a little bit better and has a little bit more contrast and more color, and your RAW file for some reason looks very dull and flat. Well, that's because your RAW file is, like I said, it's raw. It hasn't been processed yet. When you're shooting JPEG, your camera essentially processes the photo for you. It does a basic processing and it bakes in whatever color profile you're shooting with, whether you're shooting with a standard, a neutral, a portrait, a landscape, a monochrome color profile. That is baked into the JPEG and you will never get that out. So you're letting your camera do the basic processing of your photo for you. Now, when you're shooting in all those color profiles and you're saving as a RAW image, you're seeing the JPEG preview on the back of your camera, but you're actually shooting in a flat format, which is raw data, and your camera is not baking that data into your RAW image, so you can take the time to process later. So if you're like me and you shoot sports or action, like the military action that I shoot, a high frame rate is extremely important to be able to shoot lots of continuous frames. And when you're shooting RAW, your image buffer fills up a lot more quickly than if you were just shooting JPEG. But again, this is one of those things that with technology, it's just getting better. Maybe if I was shooting RAW, I could only shoot 12 to 14 frames per second before that internal memory or image buffer fills up on my camera and has to stop and process those images and let it load and make sure it's written to the card. If I were just shooting JPEG, I could probably shoot that same frame rate, but shoot more images across a longer period of time before that memory fills up. So that's kind of a negative of RAW. But again, I wouldn't worry too much about that because cameras are getting faster and faster every day. Now, one last thing in RAW versus JPEG to kind of help you make your mind up in what you want to shoot. If you're shooting a lot of fast action, maybe you have to shoot a football game and you have to send 1,000 images in a couple minutes. JPEG is very good for that, sending a bunch of quickly publishable images off very fast and not having to worry about that read and write time and processing a bunch of RAW files. You have an automatic color profile that's already been baked into the image, so the image looks pretty good. Now, on the other hand, if you have a lot more time to spend on image processing, on letting those images transfer and being able to back those images up, RAW is definitely something I highly recommend enabling on your camera, and I really recommend shooting RAW. Now you might be asking, what do I shoot? I'm giving all these recommendations for you guys. I actually shoot RAW and JPEG. So every single time I take an image on my camera, it gives me two images on my card, a RAW image and a JPEG image. Exact same thing. The RAW image is going to be about 20 to 30 megabytes and my JPEG is going to be about 2 or 3 megabytes usually. And that way, if I need to quickly transfer an image, I have my JPEG. But if I want to spend some time processing, or if I want to print the file and I want a high quality large print of my image, I always have that RAW option. Another reason I highly recommend as a beginner to shoot RAW and JPEG is because as a beginner, if you've only been shooting a couple of years, you probably don't know Lightroom or Photoshop to your full potential, and you're probably not going to be getting the full quality out of the RAW images that is possible. There's just so much data in there, and it's a lot to learn about. So as you learn how to process your images and edit them correctly, you're always going to have these RAW images saved to keep going back and keep editing and keep making them look better. And you have your JPEG images that you can do minor edits to and release right away. If you were only shooting RAW, you might not be releasing that good of a RAW file as a beginner, or if you were only shooting JPEG, you might not be shooting that good of a JPEG as a beginner. But in the future, as you get better, you can always go back, edit those good RAW files, and you can always throw some of those JPEGs away if you don't need them and they're taking too much file space. So those are my basic thoughts on RAW versus JPEG, why I personally shoot both. I'd love to know down in the comments, what do you guys shoot? Do you shoot only RAW, only JPEG? Do you shoot both? There's no wrong answer. Again, RAW is a tool, JPEG is a tool. Your camera and your camera lens are just tools to get a job done, accomplish a mission, to have fun, and there's no real right or wrong answer. There may be something that is better for one job or better for another job. So that is all for this video. I hope you guys have learned something, you know a little bit about RAW versus JPEG. If you're not shooting both, I highly, highly recommend it. And make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below if you want to see more of my videos. And until next weekend, get out and go shoot.